the divine desired two things. Right? So you have to, in the beginning was spirit. And the divine was aware of himself. He had consciousness, and it was all that was. And as depicted, it's explained in the Casey work. He eventually decided on two primary motivations. He desired expression, and he desired companionship. So we don't have to know what the divine was. We don't have to know what spirit was. We just know that that was the beginning, that it just was. And it existed for a very long time in perfect bliss and joy in its own awareness and consciousness, until it came to the decision that it wanted expression and companionship. And the greatest creation was the soul. And before the soul was created the spirit, so the divine himself created a fractal, which is a piece of himself which would be most connected to him. And then he also created an offsetting point, which was the soul, and the soul would have the encouragement to go forth and explore. And the divine created the solar systems and the galaxies and this entire universe so that the souls themselves would have a playground to go and explore and to grow, and over time to express themselves more and more. And as that expression got stronger, the individuality of the soul grew so strong that many of the souls lost contact with their spiritual self, which was the part of them that never left the divine. And then some of them not just lost sight of their spiritual self, but they had no longer any connection whatsoever to the divine, and they were left to like fables and folklore, and then religion tried to fill in the gaps as best as it could. But the soul continued in this capacity, and constantly seeking experience and exploration. And when the soul felt itself so distant from the divine, then interwoven, then came into the mix was the ego. The ego was man's representation of individuality, which is this belief that they were entirely and utterly separate. And so the journey of the soul is over time to reunify with the source from which we've come. And you do that by recognizing the ego for what it is and strengthening your spiritual intention. And with enough effort, enough incarnations, your spiritual self becomes so dominant that the egotic mind is no longer dictating any of the behavior of the incarnation. And that's when you're reaching a point of readiness to reunify with the divine. It has to shed the ego. And so the closest representation of this in the Bible is the prodigal son story. It's the closest that I could find, and that is, you have the father, the patriarch, who is stable and consistent and secure, and he has two sons. And the first son never leaves home. And so that would be represented by the spirit, right? Our spirit, it's usually referred to as our higher self. And so that's the firstborn. And then you have the secondborn, which is the more adventurous younger brother, who asks his father for his inheritance early so that he can go forth and adventure all over the lands. And the father grants it to him, to the chagrin of the older brother, who doesn't understand why his younger brother should get to be such an adventurer. But right away, the brother goes out with this money as a young boy, and the way it's depicted in the Bible is he gambles and he drinks and he womanizes. He gets caught up in the low vibration, gets caught up in the egotic tendencies of man, which are the indulgences, and he blows his inheritance very quickly. But he's full of shame and guilt, and he has so much remorse because now he has nothing, and he doesn't want to return to his father in that state, so he continues he works. It's described as him really laboring very hard, and through that process, he ends up invoking these beautiful qualities of humility and sacrifice and compassion and understanding. And years go by, and finally, with all of that humility intact and his personality hugely curtailed, he returns back to his father. And he returns back expecting his father to be full of disappointment, because the last his father had known, he was traveling to see the world and to conquer the world and to come back full of riches, whatever it was that he thought was going to be his journey, and he comes back penniless and humbled. And his father is over the moon ecstatic to have him back. He slaughters the fattened cow, like the fattest cow gets slaughtered for like the celebration, something like that. And the older brother's like, what about me? I've always been so faithful. I've always been so close to home. You've never celebrated me. And the father tries to explain how the older brother kind of plays it safe, and he's very much appreciated, but he was always safely with the divine, so to speak. But the younger brother had to learn some very powerful lessons that could only be learned by being far, far away. And that's the journey of the soul as we all experience it. And we've lost so much of our society, which is okay, it's just part of our cycle, for the longest time lost our connection to the divine. And we substituted for it with philosophy and the arts, and sometimes some literature does a great job provoking imagination. But we're all part of one singular consciousness. We just have so much ego in the mix, and we're so far from it that we don't realize that it's just simply a choice that we get to make, which is the direction we want to move in, either more towards the human tendencies, which are further away from the source from which we've come, or more back to our Father, as the prodigal son returned so humbled, but with an energy that was also in alignment with the source from which he had come. He was received back as an equal. Only difference was now that he had so much free expression because he had developed his own personality and individuality, but his vibration was comparable to that of his father, so he could be received back with great celebration.
And it sounds all surreal to me to have access to all of this. So why do you think so many people still don't really connect with these discussions? Yeah.
So I should probably disclaim this. I was studying the Bible my whole life, but I've only really gotten into it more of the last few years. So I'm not much of a biblical scholar, but it's all kind of in there. So I say that because the answer that I found, there's the parable of the sower, and then there's the story in, I think it's the book of John, where Christ is sitting with a rabbi at night. And they both point to the same understanding, and that is, and Christ says it, he says, he either be born of flesh or he be born of spirit. And if he be born of flesh, then he will always be of flesh. And if he be born of spirit, then he will always be of spirit. And if I was there, my guess is that Christ would have gone on to say, but if he be born of spirit, but have no awareness that he be born of spirit, then he shall behave like man, like flesh. And so when you fast forward now 2,000 years and you read the Law of One, the Law of One explains how about 99% of the incarnates here on earth are born of flesh. They're of man, which is that their consciousness has only evolved to a state of the collective consciousness that you're referring to. But that there's 1% that be born of spirit, which is that their consciousness, like Christ, maybe not to his level, but like Christ and maybe the disciples, that they had the potential for great awakening. And it's those people that will gravitate to these conversations most, or those that are born of flesh, that are right up at the edge of their journey of flesh.
And what about the others?
The others are watching makeup tutorials. The others are watching, what was his name? PewDiePie? What were we watching the other guy?
Terrible. I don't know what I was watching.
Whatever they're doing, though, their others are engaging in the activities and the distractions of the human realm. They seeth but see not. They heareth but hear not. Right? They have these eyes but cannot see.
And that's just meant to be.
Their heart is waxed gross. He says it's calloused. It's as if they've been affected so much by the human experience that they can't tap into their feelings that would naturally lead them in the direction of spirit. Some can. Some have to go very deep into the realm of man, only to find themselves completely unfulfilled, or even worse, where they achieve all that they set out to achieve on the journey of man, and then find that they feel more empty.
So suffering,
loss, perspective, understanding, however you want to put it. It's the journey of those that be born of flesh. And that's all part of the journey. And those that are born of spirit, they at one point were of flesh as well. They may not have been of flesh in this planetary space, but they went through their of flesh period at some point too. The only difference between their soul and the soul of man is that the soul of spirit has integrated more lessons, and so their consciousness, their energetic consciousness, is much more greatly expanded.
Perfect.